Welcome to the series, From Lovers to Strangers, The Enemies of Intimacy by Dr. Gerald Mann. Dr. Mann is the senior pastor at the Riverbend Church in Austin, Texas. Let's join Dr. Mann for more of The Enemies of Intimacy.
The doctor gave him the checkup and he said, "You know, you're in amazing health for a man of 70 years of age." And the man said, "Did I say I was 70? He said, "How old are you?" He said, "I'm 80. He said, 80 years old? He said, "You're amazing." He said, "How old was your father when he died?" He said, "Did I say my father was dead?" He said, "My father's 99 years old, plays golf every day, drives his own car, grocery shops." He said, "That is absolutely incredible." He said, "How old was your grandfather when he died?" He said, "Did I say my grandfather was dead?" He said, "What?" He said, "My grandfather's 122 years old. So he just outlived his third wife and just got married again." He said, "That's amazing." He said, "But why would a man 122 years old want to get married?" He said, "Did I say he wanted to get married?" I just like that story so much, I just had to tell it this morning. I'm trying to figure out how it connects to the sermon. Here's how it connects. We are always making false assumptions, right? And there's nowhere we do that more than in relationships. More people enter relationships with false assumptions about the person that they're loving than probably at any other times in our lives. And one of the great false assumptions is the assumption that we share the same values. I think one of the major causes of breakup in relationships is that people come into the relationship without the same number ones, without the same priorities, without the same values. We don't teach people even how to search for each other's values. And I think that's why Paul says to the early Christians, if the two of you don't share some basic belief systems, then it's better to say goodbye. David Mace, the great Quaker writer, and one of probably the person who not only has written more about successful marriage, but has lived a successful marriage, says that all marital problems boil down to two questions. What do you want? What are you willing to give up to get it? And you see, both of those questions are questions of value. What is number one in your lives? Now, I could talk to you this morning about values relating to money and raising children and all that sort of thing, but I really think there are four values that underlie all other values that you have to share in order to have a successful relationship. I think there are four basic fundamental values that have to be shared, and I'm going to represent them with little phrases I use which helps me remember them without speaking with notes, and it might help you remember them. The four phrases are shut up, stand up, gut up, and look up. Those represent the four basic values. Shut up. What does that mean? To have intimacy, people have to be able to keep their mouths shut. They have to share confidences. Always beware of the person who wants to tell you every intimate detail of his or her relationship with lover. That is almost a dead certain clue that the relationship is in deep trouble. People who have to tell everything about everybody are always... I heard two guys on the street the other day. I just caught the tail end of the conversation. I have no idea what they were talking about, but I got the gist of it. One of them said to the other one, "Did you tell her?" And he said, "Yes, I did." "Well, did you tell her it was a secret?" He said, "No, I didn't." He said, "Why not?" He said, "I didn't want her to think it was important enough to spread around." Well, now, you see, there are a lot of folks who simply don't know how to keep confidences. And if you don't share the basic value that there are some things between you that are strictly between you, then relationships fall apart. And unshared values and the point of confidentiality is where it's at. Scott Peck wrote a book called The Road Less Traveled. And I love that book, but if you just read the chapter on love, you'll be all right. He gets off and chases rabbits everywhere else, but just read the chapter on love. I recommend it to everybody. He says that we have ego boundaries. We define who we are when we're children. And this boundary and everything within it is me. And falling in love is when two people's ego boundaries collapse, and they suddenly rush toward each other like two dams breaking. And he said that's what we call falling in love. But he says it isn't long before the ego boundaries begin to snap back into place. And he says one of the things that will snap them back into place the quickest is for people not to be able to share confidences, because to be in love is to be able to share with another my deepest secrets. You know that when I'm preaching, I often use my own family as the illustration. The reason I do that is very simple. If I accuse you of something, you get defensive. If I tell you something bad about me, then you say, yeah, you can identify with that. Besides, I don't know any other way to relate except on my own personal basis. But I often talk about my relationship with my wife. This week somebody called her and said, does Gerald tell you everything that he's going to say about you before? Do you know everything he's going to say about you before he gets in the pulpit? She said, no, but I know everything he is not going to say about me. And that's true. There are some things that are off limits. Confidentiality. Shut up. You've got to be able to share confidences. The second basic value is represented by the phrase, stand up. And that simply means that for intimacy to occur, two people have to say, it's you and me, babe, against the world. There is nothing in between us. We are each other's priority. And nothing comes between our commitment to each other, including children. You know about the magic wedge. You know, we forget a lot of things about childhood, but one of the things we tend to forget is that when we're children, we're little, and everybody's bigger than us, and everybody's more powerful than us, and that's why we spend all of our childhood saying, when I get big, I used to say, when I get big, I'm going to whip my daddy. When I get big, I'm going to stay up as long as I want to. When I get big, I'm not going to have to go to school. When I get big, I'm going to be this or that. Children learn very early that the greatest power they have over their parents is the magic wedge, to drive a wedge between the parents. And once they get the wedge between the parents, it's like dope, it's addictive, and they can't quit. And it's their power source. And if the two of you are not agreeing on how to discipline and how to treat, and if you're keeping secrets, my wife started something very early with our children that I didn't realize was so important, and now I do. I give her the credit. If one of the children would say, I need to tell you something, but don't tell Daddy, she said, well, then don't tell me. Because there are no secrets between your father and me when it comes to the family. Somebody asked Charlie Shedd one time, what's the best thing, how's the best thing I can do for my children? And Charlie said, love their mother. That's the best thing you can do for their children. When there is no wedge that a child can drive between the family, it gives the child security, knows where his boundaries are. Also lets him know what a real relationship looks like. There's a lot of hollering going on about whether we ought to teach children about sex. The idea is we teach them about sex, we'll encourage them to do it. Wrong. If kids know that something real neat is going on between mom and dad, they won't settle for something cheap themselves. The best sex education, as Paul Tournier says, is for a child to see dad pat mama on the behind. He says don't give them clinical demonstrations, but let them know something very neat's going on, and then they won't settle for anything less. But you have to come before the kids, before work, before in-laws, before all those other things. Now, how do you put that into practice? I have found over the years that it's very difficult to keep that stand up for each other, that exclusivity intact. And the only thing that's been able to work for me, and I don't know where I got this, but early on, when work and school and church, and we used to live in a parsonage next door to the church, and the people in the church owned the house, and so they just walked in the parsonage whenever they wanted to. I changed all the locks on the doors. We had a deacons meeting about it. Deacons said, I went up to go in the parsonage to look into it, and I couldn't even get in. And I said, anybody who comes into my house unannounced could get shot from now on. But I didn't mean to chase that rabbit. What am I talking about? Exclusivity. Is that where we are? Stand up. you can't let anything come. Somewhere early on, we started doing three things that have allowed us to keep in focus our commitment to each other. We call it a talk a day, a date a week, and a whoopee a month. And this is what I mean. Every day, we take 30 minutes when we turn off the phones and shut away the children, and we talk. We don't have any planned agenda. We don't know what we're going to talk about. We're simply present to each other. Sometimes it goes on into an hour. Sometimes it goes into all afternoon. But there are 30 minutes a day, at least, where we have a serious, uninterrupted, meaningful conversation. A talk a day. We have a date a week. Sometimes it's going down to the 7-Eleven and getting a frosty Coca-Cola or something, but it's something. We have a date a week where the two of us do something together. Maybe it's just dinner. And then we have what we call our whoopee a month. We go away. If I have to explain all this to you, you got no imagination anyway. But we go away for an evening away from everybody, and we stay overnight. And sometimes it's at the Motel 6, and sometimes it's on the river in San Antonio, and sometimes it's at the park or wherever, but a whoopee a month. Those are the things that have allowed us to remember the second most important shared value, and that's to stand up. You have to come first before everything else. The third value that has to be shared, I think, is represented by the phrase, gut up. And that means hanging on and hanging in there when it ain't fun. Scott Peck says another amazing thing about love in that little chapter in The Road Less Traveled. He says that you can't keep from falling in love. That's without choice. That just sort of happens. Boy meets a girl and the knees get weak and the adrenaline starts flowing and it's, you fall into love. The ego boundaries collapse. But staying in love, he says, is a choice. And the kind of love that lasts is the choice to love even when the feeling's not there. And that's what I call gutting it up. To hang in there when it's not fun. And if you don't have that sort of commitment, it's very easy to lose it all. My good friend Lofton Hudson, who's one of the best marriage counselors I think who ever lived, said that a good friend of his came to see him. He'd known him for 20 years, and he'd had a good marriage from all outward appearances. And he was such a close friend, he said, I've got to have counseling, and I don't trust anybody but you, and I don't love my wife anymore. I just don't love her, and I want a divorce. Can you help me? And Lofton said, I know you too well to get into a protracted counseling session with you. He said, let me tell you what you do. You go back home and you act like you love her for 6 months, and then you come back and see me. And he said the guy never came back. When I was a kid up in Colorado, I saw my first porcupine, and I happened to be with a game biologist, the Colorado Game and Fish Commission. And I was about 12 years old, and I began to think of all the questions that 12-year-olds do, and I saw this porcupine with all these quills and everything. And I said to the game biologist, I said, how do porcupines make other porcupines? How do they reproduce? And he smiled and he said, they have to get the courage to cuddle up to the quills. Stand up means to find, and to gut up means to find the courage to cuddle up to the quills. And if you don't share that basic value of hanging on even when it doesn't feel good, then it's very difficult to have a value system at all. The fourth value, shut up, stand up, gut up, look up. And I think you know what I'm referring to. I think you have to have a basic commitment to something higher than the relationship for it to hang together. I'm not just talking about religion, but I am talking about the spiritual dimension of marriage. You have to have something higher than the marriage to make it work. And that doesn't mean you have to belong to the same church. Do you know in this church we have people who have been happily married for years, who are Protestant and Mormon, who are Jewish and Protestant, who are Protestant and Catholic. We had a happily married couple. They're no longer here. They've gone back to their home country. We had a Sikh and a Muslim, a Hindu and a Muslim. Do you know how much and how long they've been fighting Pakistan and in India? And he was a Sikh and she was a Muslim, and they had a lovely relationship. I don't think it's the kind of religion that's important so much as the kindness that comes from religion that's important. There has to be a kindness which says we are part of something grander than just our little selves and our little relationship at one point in history. We're part of something grander. When are we going to learn that two people loving each other and building what we call a family is part of God's greater plan? Do you realize that the church and the state and the school and the home are four things that make up any stable society? Those are the four building blocks of a society. But do you realize that the home can exist without the other three? You can have a great home without a church, without a state, and without a school. You can have a home. But do you realize that you can't have the other three without the family? The state falls apart, the school system falls apart, and the church falls apart without a solid family structure. And so when I say look up, I mean that I don't know how a relationship can last without looking above our own little history as a part of a grander history. To love each other for life and faithfully is to love God and to love your children's children's children, to love all of history and those who came before you and those who will come after you. I don't know of a more important thing. Now the question is, how do we put that into practical application? Well, let me tell you a story. It's a true story. It's not a preacher story, it's true. Are you there this morning? About 3 or 4 years ago, on the staff planning, we said we need to do something for families to help parents. Our parents are in trouble. We need to help parents stay together and parent successfully. So who can we bring in? And we started looking at all the best-selling authors. That was back during the boom. We had a lot of money. We could bring anybody we wanted to. And we started talking about who could we bring, you know. And we went through all these great authors that had written all these great books, and they would come for money and for the right, you know, you could get them. And we talked and talked and talked, and I said, I tell you who I want to bring in here. I want to bring Homer Hanna. And everybody looked at each other and said, who is he? Has he written anything? I said, no, hadn't written a thing. He works at South Texas Children's Home. He's the father to about 100 kids down there. He's got 3 of the most well-adjusted children I've ever seen. He's got one of the greatest marriages I've ever seen. He's one of the most self-contained, peaceful, godly men I know. And I said, I'd rather have somebody come in here who has done it and hadn't written about it than somebody who hasn't done it and has written scads about it. So we brought Homer Hanna in here. We brought him on Sunday night. Maybe some of you were here, but there were not very many. It was Sunday night, and it was the master's minority showed up, and there were about 30 couples showed up. And Homer gets up and he says, well, Gerald said you wanted me to talk about parenting. He said, let's start with this. How many of you, he said, don't raise your hands because I don't want to embarrass anybody. How many of you tithe? How many of you give the first 10% of everything that comes into your hands to God? Now, don't raise your hand, he said. He said, now, I guess you're wondering why I'm asking about that. He said, all of life's a stewardship. He said, to make parenting and marriage and the home work, you've got to set aside some values. What's most important? And he said, if you want to teach your children to live honestly and openly, you can't cheat God and expect them to be honest. And about half the people left after the first break. And I said, half the people left? He said, that's right. And he said, I'm not the pastor here, so I can say that. Well, I've thought about that over the years, and I thought, you know, it is true that life is a stewardship. I don't know that I would be that blunt, but it is true that if we're going to talk about making God, religion, our relationship to Christ, the basic value of our life, then we need to set aside time and talent and treasure. To look up together means we're going to make the spiritual commitment of our lives a priority in our relationships. I could have talked about praying together and worshiping together and all of that. But I know a lot of people who pray together and don't stay together, and worship together and don't stay together. But I don't know of anybody who brings God in as part of a priority and says, God, help us help each other to be intimate, where it doesn't work. So, what are the 4 basic values that you need to share to stay together? Shut up, confidentiality. Stand up, exclusivity. Gut up, determination. Hanging in there, cuddling up to the quills. Acting like you love each other even when you don't. It's better to act your way into a way of thinking than think yourself into a way of acting. And look up, which means to make our commitment to God a priority in the way we live at home. Not just to go and sit in church, but to make life a stewardship, to give my time, my talent, and my treasure to the spiritual side of our relationship. Those are the values I think that are basic.
Thank you for joining us for the series, The Enemies of Intimacy.